as Russian forces took the heavily fortified city of Avdiivka from Ukrainian troops, reports began circulating of the death of Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny, who had been in a Russian prison. He fell ill and he died. And that is obviously a personal tragedy for Navalny's family and friends. I do not speak ill of the dead, and that is not my intent with this video. Instead, I want to focus on the people who built up his political career, used him throughout his life, and are now opportunistically exploiting his death. And I will get into all of that in detail. I just want to point out one thing before we begin. As Mark Sloboda often points out, although Alexei Navalny is depicted as a Russian activist, a Russian politician, or opposition figure in Russia, his largest support base was not actually in Russia. It was in Washington, D.C. And we have documented evidence of all of this. But let's look at how the United States, especially the United States, is exploiting Navalny's death. So this is from the New York Times, February 16, 2024. Navalny's death raises tensions between U.S. and Russia. President Biden condemned Putin and his thugs for the Russian dissident's demise, while European allies urgently sought assurances that the United States would not abandon them. This was a Russian citizen in a Russian prison. What does this have to do with the United States? The article says President Biden blamed President Vladimir Putin of Russia personally for the reported death of imprisoned Russian dissident Alexei Navalny. He cited the case in pressing House Republicans to approve military aid to Ukraine in its war with Moscow. So it is just an opportunity to further demonize Russia and attempt to increase support for America's proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. The article continues, but while he once threatened to impose devastating consequences on Mr. Putin if Mr. Navalny died in prison, the president conceded that there was not much more he could do after the sanctions and other actions taken in the last 2 years in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death, Mr. Biden said in a televised statement from the White House. Putin is responsible. What has happened to Navalny is yet more proof of Putin's brutality. No one should be fooled, not in Russia, not at home, not anywhere in the world. It also says, asked if Mr. Navalny had been assassinated, Mr. Biden said that the United States did not have a full understanding of the circumstances. The answer is, we don't know exactly what happened, but there is no doubt that the death of Navalny was a consequence of something that Putin and his thugs did. So we don't know, but we do know Russia did it. That is what the U.S. is doing. This is what the U.S. always does. They clearly had no time to investigate what happened. They don't care what happened. They don't care what the evidence is. They have no evidence. This is an opportunity for them to advance their agenda, their geopolitical objectives, and they are going to use it regardless of what the facts are and regardless of whether or not they even had time to ascertain what those facts were. So the US government very clearly exploiting his death. Other narratives that we see across the Western media look like this. This is just an example. We'll see articles like this all across the Western media. Putin saw an existential threat in Navalny, the opposition leader whose name he dared not mention. Another article from Al Jazeera, Alexei Navalny, an arch enemy Putin wouldn't name and Kremlin couldn't scare. And you can see that all of these headlines are just a variation of the exact same narrative. Imagine that. And Navalny was Putin's fiercest political opponent, using the street and the internet to expose secret palaces and to galvanize Russians who otherwise saw no alternative to the president. Is that true? Was Navalny Putin's fiercest political opponent? Did he galvanize Russians? And the answer is no. And the answer is actually provided inside this very same Al Jazeera article. Further down, it says, only 19% of Russians approved of Navalny's work and 56% disapproved of what he did. This was according to a February 2021 survey by the Moscow-based Levada Center polling organization. And and that is the high point of his popularity, because that followed an incident in 2020 where Alexei Navalny was supposedly poisoned by a Soviet-engineered super toxic nerve agent called Novichok. Obviously, he survived that attack, and his popularity relatively surged. Compared to what it had been. So this is a Reuters article from 2020. Putin critic Navalny's approval rating surges in wake of poisoning. So clearly he benefited from this. The people around him and his team benefited from this. The United States government, which sponsored his political activity, clearly benefited from this. The only people who did not benefit from this was the Russian government, who was accused by the US government and the Western media of supposedly poisoning him. This Reuters article admits his case has attracted attention worldwide and at home. There was a huge media campaign to really pump up that narrative, if you recall that incident. It says, with Western leaders demanding an explanation from the Kremlin over what happened, according to the poll by the Levada Center. So there's the Levada Center. We'll get into who they are in just a minute. Conducted in late September, 20% of respondents approve of Navalny's activities, while 50% do not. In 2019, before the incident, his approval rating was 9%, single-digit approval rating. But the percentage of those who disapproved of him was also lower, 25%. And again, a point Mark Sloboda often makes is that most Russians have no idea who Alexei Navalny even is. And that was the Russian government's response to him and his US government-sponsored political activities, was to ignore him. So the last thing you want to do when you're ignoring someone is to turn them into a martyr. That's the last thing you would do. So you can see how the West narrative regarding Navalny and what they have accused the Russian government of doing to him in the past, and what they are now accusing the Russian government of doing following his death, you can see it does not add up with reality. Now let's talk about this polling organization, the Levada Center. It's Moscow-based, so maybe people assume that they're just coming up with a result favorable for Russia. After all, it's based in Moscow. But the truth of the matter is the Levada Center is funded by the US government. The US government not only funds the Levada Center, it funds a whole network of organizations in and around Russia to support the Russian opposition. So here is the National Endowment for Democracy's official website, ned.org. This is from September 2011. So they have been supporting this organization for a very long time. Russia, polling for democracy, the Yuri Levada Analytical Center. It says the Yuri Levada Analytical Center, an NED grantee based in Moscow, is an independent polling agency that is well known for its surveys on socio-political issues, both within Russia and worldwide. If you're funded by the US government, how are you independent? You're dependent on the US government, so how are you an independent organization? It also says, since 2009, the NED has supported 4 Levada Center research projects focusing on public opinion polling during the 2009 Moscow City Duma elections, qualitative research on effective public relations strategies for NGOs, a series of interviews on xenophobia and nationalism following the December 2010 riots, and an ongoing project focused on 2011 State Duma and 2012 presidential elections. Could you imagine if the Russian government or the Chinese government were funding an organization like this in the United States, involving itself in America's internal political affairs? Now, the National Endowment for Democracy is a US government-funded and directed organization, and it focuses on regime change. If you look at the board of directors, the people on the board of directors are people who have been involved in US wars of aggression, regime change operations, and political interference around the globe for decades. The NED was not just funding the Levada Center, it funded a whole host of organizations in and around Russia to interfere inside Russia's internal political affairs. And that includes political organizations founded by Alexei Navalny. So what are some of those organizations? This is the obituary published by The Guardian for Alexei Navalny, again, February 16th, 2024. And if you scroll down, this is what it says. It says, in 2000, he joined the United Democratic Party, known as Yabloko. Under its leadership, the party stood for liberal and social democratic values. Navalny gained an economics degree in the financial university, and from 2004 to 2007 served as chief of staff of the Moscow branch of Yabloko. A charismatic speaker, he was attracted by the concept of television debates, and in 2005 founded a social movement for young people with the name taken from the Russian word for yes, da. And then they take da and then they give it an English meaning, democratic alternative, DA, da. The US government considers both Yabloko and da as pro-Western, and we know this because the US State Department in their own cables admitted this. And the links to all of this are in the video description below, and you're more than welcome to look at them and see for yourself. So this is via WikiLeaks. Thanks to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, who is rotting in prison, slowly dying in prison, and the United States doesn't seem concerned at all. As a matter of fact, they are the reason Julian Assange is rotting in prison. This is a cable, a US State Department cable from November 2006, a guide to Russian political youth groups, part 1 of 2. They talk all about da, or democratic alternative. It says da. Maria Gedar, daughter of former Prime Minister Igor Gedar, leads DA, Democratic Alternative. She is ardent in her promotion of democracy, but realistic about the obstacles she faces. Gedar said that DA is focused on nonpartisan activities designed to raise political awareness. She has received funding from the National Endowment for Democracy. So she is getting funded by the US government through the NED. A fact she does not publicize for fear of appearing compromised by an American connection. She told us, so she's communicating with the US Embassy in Moscow. She told us that DA was a complement to a Borana, not a competitor, and is in an effort to widen the Democratic base. What do they mean by democratic? Well, we'll get into that in a moment. People who would want to join a Borana would not want to join DA, and vice versa, but we work together for a common goal. And this is a marketing strategy that corporations use. If they feel that some of their brands are becoming unpopular, they just make more brands, and they use different marketing strategies to try to attract business from all potential markets. And the US government, through its meddling in other nations' internal political affairs, they also use this strategy. They create a host of opposition groups, hopefully attracting a wider base of support. Gedar told us that DA was more a forum for open discussion than a political movement. She has organized a series of debates among people with controversial viewpoints. She is also planning to hold a summer camp in 2007 to train up 2,000 students in the ways of democratic activism. Well, what money is she using to organize all of these events? She's using US government money to do this via the National Endowment for Democracy. So the students are going to be trained up in the ways of democratic activism. But in other words, they mean she with US government money is creating a political bloc that serves US interests inside another sovereign nation, the Russian Federation. Notice that it said she has received funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, a fact she does not publicize for fear of appearing compromised by an American connection. So how is she and Democratic Alternative DA and Alexei Navalny, who founded this organization, how are they not compromised by the US government funding their organization and their political activities. Democracy, as I've said many times before, is a process of self-determination. Russian democracy is a process where the Russian people determine their own affairs, their own future. If the United States government is pumping money into Russia's internal political affairs, if they are creating political opposition movements that are skewing, interfering in this process, it is no longer democracy. It is simply foreign interference. It is not in support of democracy. That is not what the National Endowment for Democracy does. The name is a smokescreen behind which they are actually undermining democracy, undermining the sovereignty of the nations that it targets with its programs. Again, just imagine if Russia or China were doing this in the United States. There's another cable, part 2. So that was part 1 of 2. There's a part 2, and this is what it says here at the end. This is how they conclude. Russian youth are politically apathetic. The military draft is the sole issue that seems able to mobilize them because they believe that the issues do not affect them or that they cannot affect the issues. Those groups that attract our attention, they're talking about the US Embassy in Moscow and the US State Department, because they are daring or outspoken are the exception. The few genuinely democratic youth groups, and when they say genuinely democratic, that just means groups that serve US interests, help advance US interference inside Russia, are being hastened to irrelevancy by well-funded and organized government effort intent on avoiding the orange and rose-colored revolutions of its neighbors. What are they talking about? They're talking about US government interference in Ukraine. That was the Orange Revolution. That was in 2004. And also the Red Rose Revolution in Georgia. These are two countries that border Russia. The US interfered in their political systems. They overthrew the governments in both countries, and then they tried to transform them into NATO-ized strongholds. Georgia actually attacked Russian forces in 2008, and from 2014 onward, the US was planning on doing the same thing with Ukraine, just on a much, much larger scale. Now, how do we know that? How do we know that this US State Department cable talking about the orange and rose-colored revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, how do we know the US government was involved in those? And what are the implications of that, considering we know, because the cable admitted, the US government is also backing political opposition groups in Russia, all to do the same thing, to overthrow the Russian government. How do we know that? Because the Western media admitted it. So this is from The Guardian, 2004, US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. So before the 2014 overthrow of the elected government of Ukraine, sponsored openly by the United States, the US tried previously in 2004. And this is what The Guardian says. It says the campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing. I just was talking about marketing. That in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. So this is not The Guardian exposing this. This is The Guardian celebrating US interference across Eastern Europe. Funded and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, the 2 big American parties, and US non-governmental organizations. The campaign was first used in Europe in Belgrade in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. So they interfered in elections there in 2000. Richard Miles, the US ambassador in Belgrade, played a key role. And by last year, as US ambassador in Georgia, he repeated the trick, coaching Mikhail Saakashvili in how to bring down the sitting president. 10 months after the success in Belgrade, the US ambassador in Minsk, Michael Kozak, a veteran of similar operations in Central America, notably in Nicaragua, organized a near identical campaign to try to defeat the Belarus hardman Alexander Lukashenko. So this is the Western media openly admitting the US was undermining and attempting to overthrow governments in Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Serbia, and now we have the US State Department cables admitting they were doing this exact same process in Russia itself. And that was what Alexei Navalny was involved in. He was playing a role in facilitating that in Russia. This Guardian article continues. It talks about the organizations involved in all of this. The Democratic Party's National Democratic Institute, the Republican Party's International Republican Institute, the U.S. State Department, and USAID are the main agencies involved in these grassroots campaigns, as well as Freedom House NGO and billionaire George Soros' Open Society Institute. If all of the money is coming from the U.S. government and adjacent organizations, how is it grassroots? And let's take a look at these organizations. So they talk about the National Democratic Institute. This is their official website. Our supporters. NDI expresses special thanks to the National Endowment for Democracy, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and the U.S. Department of State for their continued support. So without a doubt, these are U.S. government organizations involved in regime change. Here is the International Republican Institute, National Endowment for Democracy, NDI, IRI, CIPE, and Solidarity Center welcome increased funding from Congress. So it says the National Endowment for Democracy and its 4 core grantees. I just read them, including IRI and NDI. They are subsidiaries of the National Endowment for Democracy. Following Navalny's death, not only did the U.S. government, the President of the United States, attempt to exploit his death. Not only did the Western media play a role in all of this, the National Endowment for Democracy itself wrote an op-ed, various people from the NED. This is just one example. The Atlantic Council, which is essentially a NATO think tank funded by Western governments, Western corporations, including Western arms manufacturers. This is also from February 16th, 2024. Russia's democracy movement will survive the death of Navalny. Who is this by? If you scroll down, Dylan Miles Primakov is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a senior manager for Eurasia programs at the National Endowment for Democracy. What does he say? What does he say about all of this? This is what he says. Anti-corruption campaigner Alexei Navalny, who according to Russian authorities died in prison at the age of 47, was by far the most popular and effective opposition leader to challenge Russian President Vladimir Putin during his almost quarter-century in power. And I just showed you polling data from NED-funded polling organizations explaining how absolutely, utterly unpopular he actually was. So this is just an outright lie. Or they're admitting that there is no popular pro-American opposition in Russia. It continues. It says, Navalny's death at the hands of the state represents an immense setback for Russia's democracy movement. Well, there's no democracy movement. This is the US-backed opposition. That's what they mean. That is the term they use to refer to the US-backed, funded, directed movement in Russia. But that movement has always been much bigger than just one man and will go on without him, yes, because everything is being determined in Washington, not in Russia by these proxies. The strategies and messages that Navalny developed for fighting the Putin regime have spread to a diverse group of Russian pro-democracy actors. That movement has proved itself resilient and able to adapt to more than a decade of increasingly harsh repression. When they talk about repression in Russia, they're talking about Russia attempting to eliminate US political interference within their sovereign borders, within their internal political affairs. And it will adapt to this devastating development as well. Martyrdom is an extremely powerful political narrative, and this cruel tragedy will likely cause many other Russians to devote still more effort to the struggle for freedom. So they are openly, admittedly trying to transform him into a martyr to advance their political agenda, to undermine and eventually overthrow the political order in Russia, a political order that refuses to be subordinated under the US-led so-called international order. That is what this is all about. That's what it has always been about. So that was Dylan Miles Primakov of the Atlantic Council, but also of the National Endowment for Democracy. And you might find this interesting. The current head of the National Endowment for Democracy is Damon Wilson, and he also came from the Atlantic Council. So you can see how the Atlantic Council, a think tank, promotes policies, NATO, US NATO policies toward Russia, among many other things. People from the Atlantic Council go over to the National Endowment for Democracy, and they come from many other think tanks in areas of public and private foreign policy circles. They go to the National Endowment for Democracy, where they're actually implementing those policies on the ground or through funding via proxies. What are they doing? What are they doing? They invested huge sums of money and time in Navalny and his networks. The return on investment has been disappointing, to say the least. Now he is dead. Now they're attempting to see what type of return they can get out of exploiting his death. So very important to understand, Alexei Navalny, his political activities were admittedly funded by the US government. The US government in their own State Department cables admit they're trying to replicate the same sort of political instability that they engineered in Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia, all admittedly US government-funded regime change operations. They were trying to do the same thing in Russia. They're claiming that Alexei Navalny was this pro-democracy activist. He was the most popular, the fiercest opponent of Russian President Vladimir Putin, when their own polling indicate the exact opposite. And this idea that he was pro-democracy, pro-human rights, this is a myth. And this is a myth that, again, the Western media itself dispelled. So let's look at this article here. This is the true face of Alexei Navalny. This is from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. This is a US government-funded media platform. This article is from February 2021. Navalny's failure to renounce his nationalist past may be straining his support. And we know the Western media says nationalist when it would be more accurate to say Nazi or neo-Nazi. This is what the article says. On February 23rd, the prominent NGO Amnesty International withdrew Navalny from its list of prisoners of conscience, a designation reserved for people imprisoned for who they are or what they believe. Amnesty said Navalny, who is in prison on what he and his supporters called trumped-up charges aimed at silencing him, fell short of this criteria because of past statements the rights watchdog perceived as reaching the threshold of advocacy of hatred. Xenophobic and racist hatred, to be more specific. Much of the attention focuses on Navalny's unabashed endorsement of nationalist causes in the late 2000s, including his appearances at the Russian March, an annual event that gathers ultra-nationalists of all stripes, again, they mean Nazis, in Moscow, but has dwindled in size in recent years because the Russian government is trying to crush this type of toxic ideology within their borders. In response, the liberal Yabloko party expelled Navalny. So you remember, I read his obituary. They said he was associated with that party. That party expelled him for this. But under the banner of a new group called National Russian Liberation Movement in 2007, he released a YouTube video describing himself as a certified nationalist and advancing thinly veiled xenophobia. In one clip, Navalny is shown in a dentist's outfit as footage of migrants in Moscow is interspersed with his reference to harmful tooth cavities. I recommend full sanitization, he says. Everything in our way should be carefully but decisively removed through deportation. In subsequent years, Navalny publicly softened his tone but continued promoting conservative immigration policies. By that they mean anti-immigration policies, campaigning to introduce a visa regime with Central Asia, a major source of labor migrants to Russia ahead of the 2018 presidential election, from which the Kremlin ultimately barred him. He also railed against Islamism in posts to his blog as late as 2015. So what does this tell us ultimately about who Alexei Navalny really was versus who the Western media is now trying to convince us he was? He was doing in Russia what the US had done to the elected government in Ukraine in 2014. He was involved in foreign-funded attempts to destabilize, overthrow the government of Russia and ultimately replace it, to take power as part of a client regime that would fulfill, advance US interests at the expense of Russia's interests. A repeat, a return to the post-Soviet period in Russia, where the United States and European interests held significant sway and were essentially hollowing out the country. And this is something that Russia has restored itself in the wake of, and this is something Russia is very interested in preventing from happening again, and that is why Alexei Navalny was in jail in the first place. You also have to remember that as the US government funded Alexei Navalny and the network he was a part of, attempting to overthrow the Russian government internally, the US and NATO were expanding all the way up to Russia's borders. They were admittedly overthrowing the governments in countries along Russia's border, and they fully planned to do so in Russia itself. This was a very real national security threat Russia faced. This is what they responded to in the form of their special military operation in Ukraine, unfolding right now. I just want to make it clear that Alexei Navalny himself posed no threat at all to Russia. It was the network he was a part of and the US interests behind it, and what they intended to do to Russia. Alexei Navalny was not the only one involved in this network. Following his death, many will eagerly seek to take his place. We have to remember also that the US isn't just doing this to Russia and the nations along its borders. The US is doing this all over the globe. The US is doing this here in Southeast Asia. They're using a very similar strategy to try to encircle China with US installed client regimes who are irrationally hostile toward China and transform themselves into a battering ram against China. And we have to understand the US does not just project power around the globe militarily. They have this very well-honed, massive network of political interference centered around organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy. They build up political opposition groups inside targeted countries, and they build up a whole network around them. Not just the political opposition party and the leaders, but also media, legal organizations, polling organizations. It is a state within a state. This is the process the US uses to politically capture targeted nations all around the globe. It's very important that we understand how the US is doing this. We have to work hard to expose this. So the goal of this video is not to speak ill of Alexei Navalny following his death. It's to warn people of the very dangerous agenda he was a part of while he was alive, and how that same agenda is now trying to exploit his death. I will continue covering US political interference around the globe, as well as US military aggression, both direct and by proxy. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I highly suggest you follow me on Telegram. I post absolutely everything there, including backups of all of my videos. In the video description below, you will find all of the links that I just referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of the other social media platforms I'm on. If ads pop up, feel free to skip past them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who is helping me, whether it's through one-time donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others online, sending me information, news tips, kind words, nice comments under the video. All of that is greatly appreciated. That's what makes all of this work possible. So thank you very much. And as always, thank you for watching.